In this video, we're going to talk about how to assemble miniatures. We're going to be building 3 different kits: a plastic aluminum Ceres from Games Workshop, the resin Rasgor from Black Sun Miniatures, and a metal Teutonic Grandmaster from Pegaso Models. Now, the reason I've chosen these 3 models is because the materials that they're made with, so plastic, resin, and pewter, will form the bulk of models on the market today. So the skills and information that we're going to need to build these 3 will essentially cover anything you could possibly want to build. Now, these kits are entirely plastic, resin, and pewter, but there are occasional kits that you can get that will be a combination. You might have a plastic or a resin kit with some metal pieces, or vice versa, a metal kit with some resin pieces or plastic pieces. The same knowledge applies. You just have to keep in mind certain differences in materials will require you to use either plastic glue or primarily super glue, or dictate the type of clippers you're going to use to clip pieces off. So plastic kits are going to be the most common model kits that you're going to be assembling. It's important to recognize or pay attention that all these pieces are numbered on the sprue. Now, for a character like this, it's not really that important whether you clip them all off the sprue or not, but for certain squad size kits like tactical squads, certain legs and arms are paired together and they will be numbered as such. So it's important to pay attention when you're building those kinds of kits to quickly read through the instructions and see if certain pieces are numbered. You don't want to clip off everything first and then realize that you screwed up the pairing and now have to try and figure out which piece goes to which, because unfortunately numbers only exist on the sprue and not the piece itself. So when I build a kit, I typically tend to go step by step. I'll clip off all the pieces for, say, step 1. I'll clean them all at the same time, glue them together, and then set them aside to dry while I go on to the next step where I clip the pieces off, clean them, and then glue them together. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I find it helps me stay organized, and especially when I'm building a squad-sized kit, doing all of step 1 before moving on to step 2 allows me to speed through the process without getting bogged down or taking forever to build the kit. But however you want to build the kit is up to you. There's no right or wrong way to do this. It's whatever you feel comfortable with or enjoy doing. Some people want to build models individually, and some just want to freeform clip everything off and go crazy. So to build a plastic kit, we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need clippers to take the pieces off the sprue. We're going to need a hobby knife and nail files to clean all the mold lines and sprue remnants off of the pieces. And then we're going to need plastic glue to glue our pieces together. I have 2 different types of clippers, or 2 different clippers here, because I want to illustrate something that's really cool about this pair of God hand clippers, and something that you have to keep in mind when you're using clippers that aren't quite as good as these at clipping pieces off sprue. Now, what I mean by this is when clippers cut pieces, there is a natural shearing force that happens. Because the way these clippers indent with the flat side here and then the 2 angled points there, what will end up happening is the plastic ends up being squeezed or sheared in one direction, and you end up with a tearing force that happens from this side in this direction. So what I mean by that is when you clip a piece of plastic, you can see that it's not a clean cut on both sides. It's flat on one and it's pinched on the other. Now, this pinching is the shearing process I'm talking about, and what will happen with most clippers, if you clip too close to a model and you try and clip flush with a piece, this shearing process ends up pulling bits of plastic from the model as the sprue gets clipped in that direction. So when you're using a regular pair of clippers, what you actually want to be doing is clipping slightly off the piece and not flush. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So when I want to cut this piece, rather than take my clippers and go straight flush, I actually want to just cut slightly off. You can clip there, you can clip there, And the reason being is that any shearing process will be completely isolated to this extra sprue piece, which we can clean off afterwards. We're not going to accidentally damage or pull pieces of plastic from the actual model. So we're just going to go around and we're going to clip slightly off. And what we'll be left with is a piece like this that has these little sprue tabs, which we can then go back in with our clippers and we can clip flush without worrying of this shearing. Because what happens now is when we clip, there's no opposing force of the sprue holding the piece in place. And so the energy from the shearing just goes out to the right. So we're just going to go around the edge and we're going to clip off these excess tabs. And now we're ready to go in with our hobby knife and modeling files to get the mold line and the rest of these little pieces. Now, part of why I like these God hand clippers so much is because they're specifically designed to cut without any of that shearing force. And they do this with an actually very clever design of the blades. So most clippers will have the blades meet point to point. And so what happens is when it meets, it creates that shearing force without any direction to mitigate or to send this energy out. What the Xuron clippers attempt to do, but don't do quite as well, and what these God hand clippers do very, very well, the blades are actually slightly offset. And so what happens is when you clip, this shearing force, rather than being sent left and right, into the piece and into the sprue, is actually sent this way, if that makes sense. And so rather than force the pieces apart, it just slices them neatly without any effort. So what this means is that rather than have to worry about cutting slightly off of a piece and having to trim afterwards, we can literally go in, right flush, and clip, and we get none of that shearing effort or that shearing force. And that reduces the effort and time spent because we're not clipping these pieces twice. It literally just gives us a flush clip off the sprue on the first try. Now that we have the piece off the sprue, we need to clean up both mold lines and the remaining pieces of sprue from where we clipped. These little pieces are fairly easy to clean. You just take your hobbying knife and very gently trim away. I don't use super sharp X-Acto blades for this process simply because when I'm trimming, I don't want to accidentally slip and cut myself. Just be careful. The more you do this, the more comfortable you will be with the motion, and you'll be able to gauge exactly how much force you need to clean these pieces. So we're just going to take our blade and we're just going to gently move in a downward slicing motion to clean that piece of plastic. We're just going to go around and we're going to do that to all of these little extra bits from where the sprue was clipped. Now that that's done, we need to go and tackle the mold lines. Mold lines are fairly easy to find. If you think about how the actual piece was molded as two halves of a mold, that sprue line is going to run right down the middle of a piece where that plate meets. And so on this piece, for example, you're going to see that it runs along the entire length, all the way around the piece. And to start, we're going to use our modeling knife again. But rather than go in a cut motion, downward like this, we're going to go in a scraping motion using the flat of the blade and just gently scraping at the mold line. Now you don't want to be too forceful at this step because if you remove too much, you're going to cut into the detail, you're going to remove too much of the plastic. And we're just going to gently go around and remove as much of this as we can. Now that that's done, I'm just going to go back in with a hobby file, and I'm going to do a very gentle pass over mold lines that the hobby knife couldn't clean, and over certain areas that I don't want to risk using the hobby knife to damage the detail, like on the rune of this leg. So on this surface, I'm just using a flat modeling file to clean it smooth. And then for something like these curved inner surfaces, I'm going to use a modeling knife with a bit of a curve to the top. Just to gently clean. Now it's important to be thorough at this step. Nothing takes away from a fully painted and finished miniature than going back and seeing mold lines where it was missed in the assembly process. Even if the model is ultimately designed for or destined for tabletop play and not for competition, you want your models looking their best, and it's worth spending the extra time to really make sure these pieces get a thorough cleaning. Now that that piece is done, I'm going to do the rest of the pieces of step 1, and then we will put all these pieces together. Because I've never built this kit before, I'm going to be dry fitting the pieces together to make sure I understand how all the pieces connect. And then using the applicator brush that comes with the semi cement. And there you have it. That's step 1 complete. We just have to set this aside to let it cure for a few minutes while we move on to the next step. And we repeat this process until we have finished assembling the model. Having completed all the steps, you can see that I've basically finished building Xeris. I've pretty much glued everything on as is, except for his 2 shoulder plates. I have chosen to leave these off as sub-assemblies. I will paint them along with ceras separately, and then put it all together once they're all painted. The reason I've chosen to leave his shoulder plates off for painting as a sub-assembly, as you can see, with the plate on, a lot of the underside of the plate as well as the interior of the spine is covered and would be difficult to reach with a brush. It's not so bad on this side, but on this half with all this cabling and his extra arm in the way, I chose to leave the plate off to make it easier for myself. I'll probably paint the interior, all the parts that are covered by the shoulder plate, glue the plate on, gap fill where the seams are before finishing the rest of the model. Now that we've finished building our Xeris model, I noticed that there are a couple of gaps where the plastic pieces meet. So we're going to do something called gap filling to hide these gaps. And what we're going to need is a brush and some Vallejo plastic putty. So to do this is quite simple. Vallejo's plastic putty comes with this very handy squeeze applicator. So for a gap on something like the base over here, what we're going to do is we're going to squeeze just a little bit. We're going to wet our brush, and then we're just going to brush the putty into the seam. Now, Vallejo's plastic putty has a pretty nice working time. It does take about 5-10 minutes to start curing, so you have time to work the putty into the seams before it'll dry. But I would still recommend doing little pieces of the model at a time. And that's it. So we're going to gap fill some of the other areas like his ball joints, and then return to this piece of rock once the putty's cured. If the gap or the seam still exists, we're going to go back in again with some more plastic putty and keep filling it in until the seam is fully covered. And with the gap filling done, our model assembly is complete and ready for paint. When building resin and metal models, much of the process is the same as building a plastic kit, with a couple of notable differences. The first is that the pieces aren't on a sprue. Because of the way the parts are molded, you will typically have tab lines like on this pewter sword here, or resin joins where the airflow, or where the mold has been cast to allow the resin material to flow through smoothly and easily. What we're going to need to build these kits, very much similar tools. We're going to need a pair of clippers to clean or clip off parts. We're going to use a Xuron for clipping the resin model. And for the metal model, we are going to be using an old pair of Games Workshop clippers. These are really, really good for clipping metal models as well as paper clips without suffering much wear and tear. I would not recommend using clippers with softer blades like the Xuron or the Godhand because you will damage your clippers. We're also going to need a hobby knife and modeling files to clean up our pieces, as well as superglue and accelerant. For the purpose of this video as well, I'm going to be showing you how to pin parts onto a model. So for that, we're going to be using a pin vise, a set of drill bits from Dremel, and for our pin, we're going to be using a paper clip. As with on the plastic model, because this resin tab is joined between two parts of a model, we don't want to be clipping flush with the piece because of concern for the shearing force. What we want to do, as with a sprue, is to clip slightly off the piece, so in the middle, to dissipate that shearing force. Now, once it's been separated, we can then begin to remove each side of the tab. What I always recommend, especially with these large resin tabs, is to not clip off the entire thing at once, but to work our way down. This one is a little easier, but a bigger tab, for example, like on his feet. If you wanted to clip these tabs off his feet, you would, rather than go straight from the very, very base, flush with the model, you would clip off chunks at once and work your way down. The reason we do this is the same reason we don't clip flush with a piece on a sprue. It's to avoid any damage to the model from any of the shearing force. And by taking off smaller pieces of the tab at once, we can control how much of that we're removing. So very simply, we're just going to clip our way down to the piece. The process is the same with metal pieces. We don't want to clip flush for risk of damaging the model. We're going to just clip slightly off and work our way down. And it's okay if a little bit of the tab remains. We can go back in with our hobby knife and modeling file and sand that down. Now, once we've cleaned all the poor tabs and excess pieces off of our parts, we're going to clean each piece like we would a plastic figure. We're going to take our hobby knife and our modeling files, and we're going to clean any mold lines and tabs before we assemble our model. An important step when assembling resin and pewter models, part of the molding process for these materials is a release agent that's applied to the molds to help the models release from the molds once they've been cast. Unfortunately, what this means is that oftentimes there is a thin residue or thin film of residue on these pieces of this release agent. If you don't clean these pieces, it can make primer and paint adhere poorly to the materials, making them very difficult to paint and more likely to chip and flake, especially if they're gaming pieces and you're handling them a lot. So once you've cleaned your resin and pewter pieces, it's important to give them a good scrub. All you need is water and dish soap and an old toothbrush. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to give all of these pieces a good soak in warm water with some dish soap. We're going to scrub them down individually. We're going to rinse them off in clean warm water, and then we're going to set them aside to dry. What you want to do as you're scrubbing each piece is you want to make sure that you're getting your bristles into all the little nooks and crannies. It's not usually the large surfaces you have to worry about because as you're scrubbing, the bristles will naturally scrub these large areas. It's these little undercuts and all these little fiddly parts and bits that you want to make sure you're scrubbing. If your resin piece has little fragile pieces that you don't want to break off, just be a little careful when you're scrubbing. You don't need to apply too much force. You just need the bristles to get into all the little parts and just get the model nice and soapy. Once that's scrubbed, you transfer the piece to the warm water to rinse off the soap. And we're going to repeat this process for all of our pieces. With all of our pieces scrubbed, all we have to do now is dry them off. We're going to use a sheet of paper towel to place all of our pieces on. And then we're going to use another piece of paper towel on top to dab off most of the water before setting it aside to air dry. Now, typically this will probably take a couple hours. I like to leave them overnight just to make sure. You don't want any water in any of the little nooks or crannies to be interacting with your super glue. Water can cause super glue to mist up or to build this little film that doesn't provide a clean joint. Now you can use an airbrush to just spray air, or you can use a can of compressed air to help speed up this drying process along. It's up to you. Depends on how patient you are. Now that I've cleaned off most of the water, I'm going to set these aside for a few hours to dry and then return to finish my assembly. So as I was dry fitting this model, I realized that his left arm, the gauntlet, and the way it joins to his upper arm might not have the strongest join if I just use super glue. And so what I want to do is pin both pieces together to create a stronger join. Now to do this, we're going to have to drill a hole in both pieces, and then we're going to have to insert a paper clip to be our pin. This piece is fairly straightforward to figure out where we want to put our pin. It comes with a pre-sculpted oval that is centered in the gauntlet of the forearm. So realistically, I would just have to put a hole in the center of each of these pieces, and it'll make for lining up the pin very easy. A trick I learned, if you can get the pieces to fit flush, but you're not sure about where to drill your holes, is to actually use a dab of black paint. We're going to put a dot, and we're going to try it on this piece. We're going to put a dot on the upper arm. I'm going to put a dot of black paint on the upper arm, and then we're going to dry fit the two pieces together, and hopefully it will transfer the dot onto the forearm. Now, it didn't work, so clearly these pieces don't fit flush together, which only reinforces the need for a pin to strengthen the joint. To create our pin, we're going to use a Dremel and pin vise, and we're going to make sure that we pick a drill bit that matches the diameter of the pin that we're going to use. I like this Dremel set because it has a variety of drill bits I use for both magnetizing and pinning, as well as for drilling things like gun barrels and ports. I know that the smallest drill bit matches the exact diameter of a pin, or of the paper clip I'm going to use. So that's the bit I'm going to use. To insert our pin, we're going to loosen the receiver, insert about halfway, and then we're going to tighten the receiver. And to operate a pin vise is fairly straightforward. We're going to palm the base of the pin vise, and then we're going to grip the lower part with our pinky, ring, and middle finger. The top can spin independently, and it's this that we're going to operate with our thumb and our index. And we're going to rotate in a clockwise motion to drill in. So starting with the upper arm, we're going to line up our pin vise with the center. And then we're just going to slowly apply pressure using the palm of our hand to push the pin vise and our thumb and index to rotate the pin. Now you can see the drill bit slowly extracting some of the resin as it drills deeper. And a way you can test the depth of how far you've drilled is to simply use your finger to mark the very edge and then remove the pin vise. So here we've got about 1/2 centimeter. I can afford to drill a little bit more, but I don't want to drill too far for fear of coming out the backside of his arm. That's a solid amount. That's a solid depth. So what we want to do now is we want to take our paperclip. We're going to insert a straightened end and glue it and set that aside to cure while we drill out the other hole. Now, because we are assembling resin and pewter, we have to use super glue for this. We can't use plastic glue. We're going to dab a drop of super glue on the end of our paperclip, and then we're just going to insert this I'm going to insert this into the forearm, and we're going to set that aside for a few minutes to cure while we drill out the hole in the forearm. Repeating the process in the center. We want to make sure that when we're drilling our hole, that we're drilling perpendicular to the surface. This makes it easy for the pin to go in straight and line up more easily. If you drill at an angle on one piece, you then have to find the corresponding angle on the receiving piece and drill accordingly. If we just drill perpendicular to the joining surface, it makes it easy to line up the pin. Now what we want to do when we check the depth on our second hole is to figure out how much of our paperclip we have to clip and leave. So I know that whatever I clip off the paperclip and leave remaining cannot be greater than this. So I'm just going to eyeball it. So it brings me to, I would say, about halfway between the upper arm and this bend right here. So using my metal clippers, I'm going to lightly brace the paperclip on this end. Remember, the shearing force sends the piece, it sends the force in this direction away from the flat end of the clippers. With something like a paperclip or a pin, this will send the piece flying, which you don't want. It's sharp and you don't want to lose an eye or lose the paperclip. So we're just going to brace and clip. Fits pretty well. There are some existing gaps here that I am seeing, but I saw this when I was dry fitting the piece before, and this is something I'm just going to probably have to gap fill. It looks like there's a couple of parts on this model that will require some sculpting to gap fill. And this is a natural process. Resin and pewter materials tend to sometimes shrink or warp as they harden in the mold and as they're released. And so pieces don't often fit as perfectly as they do with plastic models. And that's just a byproduct of the material and something we have to deal with. So now that we have the piece pinned, we're going to glue them together by dabbing some super glue down the pin and onto the flat. Now you simply repeat this process with all the pieces, pinning as desired until your model is fully assembled. Now, when you're assembling pieces with superglue, sometimes you'll find that you want the superglue to cure pretty much instantly rather than hold pieces together while waiting for the superglue to naturally cure. Now, this is where something like superglue accelerant can come into play. Something to keep in mind with accelerant, though, while it does cure superglue pretty much instantaneously, it does result in a weaker bond. And so you might want to consider pinning pieces that you use accelerant on. Accelerant is also very poisonous, so you want to make sure that you don't get it on your fingers and that you wash your hands after you are done using it. The bottle also comes with a spray applicator. Obviously, you don't want to be aerosolizing the accelerant. So what we do is we're going to unscrew the cap and we're going to use the spray tube to just dab some accelerant onto the pieces that we want to cure, or where the super glue is that we want to cure. Make sure the cap is on securely enough that if you were to knock this bottle over, which happens a lot, you don't spill it. So now the assembly on these models is complete. You can see that I've chosen to leave the cape off of Rasgor and the shield off of this Teutonic Knight, both for the same reasons. They obscure detail on the back of the model and would make it much more harder to paint, especially on the Rasgor. You can see that the entire back half of this model is basically covered in the cape, and were I to leave it on, it would make it very difficult to paint. So I have chosen to paint both separately and then attach them together when I have painted, at the very least, the backside. Now I recognize that there are some gaps on the cape where it meets the body that might need to be filled once I've painted the back and attach the cape, but before I finish the rest of the model. So that's something I have to keep in mind as I'm working on a piece like this. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like. Subscribe for more awesome content in the future. And don't forget to check out my Instagram at SirJohnTheHoe. That's it for now. Until next time, happy hobbying.